Thank you all very much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jackie Curry. I work in the development team for Cumbria Community Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's online presentation, Voices from the Frontline. This is our first major online event, and we've brought people together today to learn about how Cumbria has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, how the Community Foundation has responded, and to share the experience of key people on the front line. We're offering this event as a briefing and a thank you to our supporters. It is also an opportunity for you to share your own experience and thoughts on how to shape the rebuilding and renewal of all of our communities. I'd like to welcome our panel and to thank them for their time and support. Assistant Chief Constable Andy Slattery, who as Chair of the Cumbria COVID-19 Strategic Coordination Group has led the multi-agency response to COVID-19 in Cumbria. Lindsay Carver from Allerdale Citizens Advice Bureau. Hugh Tomlinson, Chief Executive of Age UK South Lakeland, and a couple of his colleagues today, and Veronica Waller, Senior Project Manager for the Farmer Network. To begin today's session, Andy Beeforth, our Chief Executive Officer, will explain the Foundation's response to the implications of the COVID-19 outbreak for vulnerable people here in Cumbria, outline what the needs are in the county and what the Foundation is doing to try to address those needs. Our panel members will then give an overview of the implications of COVID-19 for their own organisation and what challenges lie ahead. We'll then open the floor to questions, and as Andrew has explained, please direct your questions through the chat facility and we will attempt to answer as many as we can. We'll then break up into breakout groups to allow for a more focused group discussion. We've tried to form the breakout groups along regional lines to help draw out any issues specific to your area. But to help ensure a good spread of people in each breakout room, you may find yourself in a different part of the county, so to speak. Please do contribute regardless of where you find yourself. We'll come back together. It'll all happen like magic with Andrew's technical wizardry. And group leaders will then be invited to feedback on the breakout discussion before we take any final questions. We hope to keep this session to an hour. You're all busy people, but I know there are lots of very pertinent things for us to discuss, so please forgive us if we do go over time. In an attempt to keep to time, I'll forward you on to Andy Beeforth, our CEO, and thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you again for everyone for joining us today. If we can go up to the first slide, I'm going to absolutely race through this because we don't have a lot of time, but we can circulate the slides afterwards if people need it. So this first slide is just what has happened to Cumbria in the terms of context of COVID in comparison to the rest of the country. And the first two lines cover numbers of cases and deaths versus the England average. And you can see, very sadly, those numbers are much greater in Cumbria than the national average. So that's something that's very telling and actually very sort of heartbreaking, really, to think what's actually been happening in our county. But then the next slide down is, and although there's a lot of need generated by the illness, sadly the greatest need is generated by the economic impact. So that next numbers are about increases in universal credit. So 67% increase in across England, but in the heart of the Lake District, nearly 300%. And then the final numbers, and this is one of the reasons why we've got Hugh and his team speaking, is just we know that older people, by their susceptibility of COVID, their need to be locked down and kept safe has placed additional strains. And we already knew we had a super-aged population, and you can see that just over 18% in England, but in South Lakeland, 28.5% of people over 65. So if we can move on, Andrew. We did a survey. These are the results. This is one key result of a survey we did of charities in the immediate weeks following the lockdown. Many of our charities can't fundraise, they can't have fundraising events, they don't have ticket income, they don't have they can't trade through their charity shops. And the most telling number on here is 59% of the responding organisations said they had 6 months or less in reserves for actually staying in operation. So this is just a really important slide to talk about the context and the dangers facing some of our charities, some of the organisations that we rely on to fund to address the issues in our community. So if we can move on, please, Andrew. So we're absolutely delighted. On the 17th of March, we created the COVID-19 Response Fund. and we have now collected just under £1.5 million. I'm delighted to say we've been able to repurpose just over £300,000. So, and people might be just curious, we won't stay here for very long, but we had some very generous, two particularly generous, but a number of very generous donations from individuals, but also would like to thank and recognise local charitable trusts that came in and supported the fund very early on. And the National Emergencies Trust, which people may have become aware of, has been our second largest donor, and we expect them to continue giving. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And this is really the serious work. This is where have we spent the money. And I'd like to thank Kevin and everyone on our grants panel that have been meeting weekly to make awards. And you can see that this week we're delighted to say we've actually now just spent over £1 million to 138 groups. And that just over £500,000 column that's sticking out very significantly has been about the response to people who are very vulnerable, self-isolating, who've either needed food delivered to their homes or medicine delivered to their homes, or who, because of financial hardship, are requiring food. But if you also then scan across the rest of the bar chart, you'll see a range of needs met. But I think it's really important to say, and Andy may reflect on this as well, the amazing response in Cumbria, because of our experience with disasters in the past. We have had over 300 new pop-up organisations. These are self-help organisations. But because of the infrastructure we've put in place, we've had a telephone helpline and local hubs, meaning that the work of volunteers and volunteer groups has been coordinated with the public sector. So I would imagine that Cumbria has had one of the best, if not the best, community responses.
It's really strange, isn't it?
Just a couple of other strands coming out of there. Supporting carers and care organisations, that's included hospices and the Age UK organisations. Less money into mental health support and youth at this stage, because many of those organisations simply haven't been able to operate, but we have funded them to operate differently, to introduce training in new technology. But I think at time we'll need to move on. And yeah, this is just where did we spend the money? Everyone's very interested. Who was the winners and who was the losers across the county? And I think essentially, with the exception of South Lakeland, which has got significantly more money, and that's in part because it's got the largest elderly population, but also one of our major private donors made some specific gifts in connection with some organisations that are based within the county. But I think we just need to move on with time on that one. And this is the final slide. This is, in many respects, COVID has only just started to impact on our communities. We may feel like we're starting to come away from this, but this is that the real need is yet to be seen, we think. The economic need, our tourism industry, in effect, is going to have 3 winters. It employs 65,000 people and has an income of between £2 and £3 billion a year. 24% of our workforce are currently protected by furlough. As we go into an expected recession and those furlough jobs turn into some unemployment, then we expect young people to bear the brunt of unemployment, but also we've got a generation of young people whose education's been seriously impacted by not being able to attend school. Many of our older people will still choose to stay at home. And the impacts of that around isolation and the ill health and the emotional impact of that is great. I'm delighted we've got Veronica on from Farmer Network, because our farmers already faced great uncertainty with Brexit approaching, and now they've had to operate in this new environment. And then the final comment on there is just about the mental stress and distress caused by this, and the need that we will want to have to support people through that. So it's not a pretty picture. I think it's important in a nutshell to show you both what we've funded and what we believe is the shape of the need going forward. Thank you very much.
I'm Slattery, I'm Assistant Chief Constable here in Cumbria, and I'm also Chair of Cumbria LRF and the SCG. Just to give you a flavour of what we've been doing, and I apologise if some of you already know this, the LRF is obviously the multi-agency permanently sitting body in the county which plans for emergencies. The SCG is the response to a particular emergency, and I happen to chair both, which is just an unusual circumstance. So since we started as an SCG in March, and I've been working on this since the first week in February internally, but since I took over in March at the SCG, the really critical pieces of work that we've been working on, first of all, was the hospital capacity when we had the reasonable worst case scenario figures given to us. We expected the NHS to be overwhelmed, and as a result, we worked very closely with the hospitals to build capacity both in the hospitals and outside in the 5 leisure centres around the county, where we put additional recovery beds into those, which is a really, it was a hard piece of work to do. We had to do it very quickly. Cumbria was hit with the virus before many other areas. We're not fully sure why yet, but we were the only local authority area who did that outside the Nightingale hospitals, but we were a long way from the Nightingale hospitals, which were set up sometime later. So that was a really important piece of work. We worked with a lot of different partners on that, including voluntary contributions from businesses around the council who were massively helpful. Personal protective equipment became the next critical issue as the amount of PPE available was restricted, and it became the LRF's role to coordinate the distribution of PPE. We never, we said, touch wood, ran out of any items of PPE, but it was extremely close down to the wire at times, where we literally had less than 24 hours supply of critical items of PPE. So, that relied on a lot of agencies coming together to make that happen. Shielding, obviously, as the lockdown measures were brought in, was critically important, and that's where a lot of the voluntary groups have really shown the worth here. In terms of, we've already spoken about the 300 new bodies that were set up to assist in shielding and supply of medicine and food, but also the Support Cumbria website that ended up with 2,000 new volunteers volunteering on there to help in all kinds of ways across the county. So that was an area where I think all local authorities expected that would be really, really difficult to do, to shield all those people in the community. How on earth were we going to provide food and medicine to them? But obviously, Cumbria has got a long history of responding to emergencies, well-established partnerships between public and voluntary sector. And that was, I have to say, one of the smoothest pieces of work that went through because of the massive outpouring of support from the community. And I know Angela Jones, who coordinated a lot of that from the County Council, was very grateful for the support we got. As the outbreak moved along, care homes became the next critical area for us. And sadly, a lot of people have died in care homes in Cumbria. But we have had a really robust response to that, multi-agency response, with the outbreak control teams working in care homes. And I'm glad to say that the numbers of cases and deaths in care homes has come down significantly and is now a lot more stable. And I suppose that the final area that we responded to was the lockdown measures themselves. You'll have all seen the impact that implementing the lockdown measures had, how difficult it was to get people to comply with them from a policing perspective. And then when the lockdown measures started to be released incrementally, that became very much more difficult. I know that the National Park and their large network of voluntary rangers have done an awful lot of work on that, but the National Trust, the district councils, etc., have all been involved in that effort to manage the lifting of lockdown restrictions, and we're still in it. So the next areas of challenge for us really are this end of lockdown, what that's going to look like. The latest indications I've got are that the 4th of July will end up being a day when the pubs are likely to open. They are possibly going to open with people allowed into pubs. The distancing rules might be reduced from 2 metre to 1 metre, and of course the football's restarted. So you can imagine what that Saturday, the 4th of July, is likely to be like in the county. There's no decision yet on the easing of the overnight stay restrictions, and that isn't expected to come on the first week of July. It may come a couple of weeks later in time for the school holidays. But obviously that's something that our communities in Cumbria are really keen to find out when that's going to come to an end and their businesses can restart, and some of the staff returned from furloughing. So we are in a transition period where the SCG, because it is an acute response mechanism for us to respond quickly, is likely to step aside as the Health Protection Board has been established, with Colin Cox chairing that. And that's the role of that is a statutory responsibility to manage the long-term public health implications of the virus. So the roles of the agencies are likely to change slightly, but the SCG will essentially go into a dormant state, ready to stand up again if required to do, in order to meet the needs of any future outbreak or peak. And we're waiting for the latest projections on what that demand might be. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what the SCG's been up to. But we've done an interim operational review of how the SCG operated, and just got results today. All of that's extremely positive. You know, we do have a fantastic multi-agency, public and voluntary sector response to emergencies in the county, and I'm glad to say that everybody really stepped up this time. And to date, it's not over yet, but to date, I think things have gone well from my perspective, and I'm very grateful for everybody's assistance. That's that.
Okay, so hello everybody, I'm Veronica. I work for the Farmer Network Limited, and we operate in Cumbria and the Yorkshire Dales. We're a membership organisation that's run by farmers for farmers. Andrew, could you just take me on to the next slide if that's okay? So Cumbria Community Foundation has kindly supported us in our sort of approach to sort of helping farmers throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one of the things I would say about Cumbria Community Foundation is how quickly they worked and how quickly they turned around our requests for funding, so that we were able to get up and running within a few weeks of the outbreak starting. So we're really grateful to CCF for just the way they operate. And this is just a copy of our flyer. We put together a flyer that we sent out to our farmer networks in Cumbria. And basically we're saying, if you need help, please call us. Some of the things that we've offered I'll cover in a second, but it's really information about the support schemes that are relevant to farmers, anything else that they need, sourcing supplies, preparing contingency plans, and finding emergency labour. So those are the basic messages, but really just call us if you need help throughout the crisis. Andrew, would you mind just going on to the next slide? So part of my role, I'm a grants advisor, and I've had to do a lot of learning about all the different COVID-19 support schemes, and also think through how those are most applicable to farmers. And how have farmers been impacted? Well, many have lost income because of the impact on milk prices, particularly initially, those that had processors that were selling to caterers or food service providers got milk price cuts very early on. Also, the many farms in Cumbria that have diversification businesses, often tourism, many farmhouse B&Bs, many self-catering businesses, but also other ones that are perhaps adding value. Cheese suppliers have been quite badly impacted, where those have been artisan sales, for example, through farmer markets. So those are the sort of calls that we got early on, and I've kept abreast with all the different support schemes and talk to farmers about what they might qualify for. So we have an e-news that goes out to all our members. We have a newsletter, but we've also used, excuse my dog, agricultural business suppliers to get the word out. I've given a lot of one-to-one advice over the phone, but I've also tried to do clinics. Did some of these last week. We're trying to get farmers to use Zoom, and we've been hand-holding them. So I've held clinics going through the different support schemes. So next slide, please, Andrew. So what other supports have we been offering? Well, we developed an emergency labour scheme. Particularly earlier on, we were really worried about what would happen to particularly one-man band, small family farms, if they actually got COVID-19 themselves and were seriously ill. Our average age of our farming population is close to 60, and we're worried that we're dealing with quite a vulnerable group. In practice, we've had less demand for that because, fortunately, many of them very effectively isolated, particularly during lambing and calving. But we're still worried about the implications of a test and trace system on them, and what the implications are if they are exposed to coronavirus and have to stay within their own farmhouse and not necessarily be able to get out to stock. So we're operating that scheme. We've got some volunteers there ready if needed. We've also been encouraging farmers to write contingency plans so that people know what to do if they themselves are taken ill. A lot of stuff is in farmers' head and not necessarily written on paper. And we've been talking to stakeholders about the impact on farm businesses of the outbreak, issues such as social isolation, but also what the impact is on trading. We've had a clinic today with the Livestock Auctioneers Association about the future of live auctions, and how they might operate both now and into the autumn. So there's lots of things to think about looking forward over the next 6 to 12 months on how farmers operate in Cumbria. So I know time is tight, so I'll leave it there, but we can take questions and discussion later on.
Well, the experience of Educate South Lakeland for the COVID-19 response was initially we allowed ourselves 3 minutes of blind panic, and then we realised we had to work out what we were going to do in the short term. Because of the lockdown, obviously we had to shut our estate of 10 shops across South Lakeland, which provides just 67% of our income. But the meeting of the senior management team, we decided that in the 46 years of our existence, if we don't step up and support the older people of the district now, we were never more needed than we were needed in the last 3 or 4 months or 3 months or so. So we had to, it was a unanimous decision that we were going to step up. I seem to spend the next 2 or 3 weeks doing nothing but working on cash flows to make sure that we could exist. First of all, I was looking to exist for a month, and then 3 months, and then 6 months. The fantastic thing, and I'm amazed at the speed that CCF managed to turn around funding. There's been a number of opportunities for funding for charities, and a large number of charities throwing their hats at that funding. But CCF, as far as our experience goes, was way the first and the most agile organisation. We got the documentation and the opportunities to put a bid in. What that meant for us is that I could stop concentrating on cash flows and balance sheets for a while and start looking at what we can do in terms of practical support. So we had to change the shape of the services that we delivered. I'll pass you over to Phil, who headed up our C19 response team. And
yeah, good afternoon, Phil White. I'm the partnership manager here at Age UK. And as Hugh said, we had to take an approach in terms of how we dealt with COVID-19, and we decided that we needed to be a really agile and flexible organisation and take the stance that we're going to be problem solvers. As a result of that, as you can imagine, we've been supporting lots of older and vulnerable people across South Lakeland, and we've been supporting them with things like shopping and prescriptions and things that people would perhaps guess. Certainly up to now, we've been, at its peak, we were taking 80 calls a day into our helpline, and as we sit here today, we've had over 4,000 calls for support and help across South Lakeland. We also had to bear in mind that whilst we wanted to support people and support those who were shielding, it was also important that whilst we're dealing with them, we also took into account that we didn't want them to be vulnerable to other dangers. And so with the funding, we were able to develop our own payment system from scratch using our Compass online system, so that people didn't have to hand over money, PIN numbers, cards. And so we got that system up and running very, very quickly, meaning that people were confident that when they were having shopping delivered and having to pay for that it was being done in a secure way. And what that allowed us to do was also to work with a number of local voluntary groups as well. And what the COVID-19 has done for us, one of the positives is that we've been able to coordinate and bring together lots of smaller groups and the volunteer groups, and actually we're able to work with them so that they could also benefit from the same systems that we developed. So they were also working with our online secure payment system as well. In terms of moving forward, whilst we're doing those things that most people would perhaps anticipate, as problem solvers, we've also had to deal with a number of other strange enquiries. So as an example, we had an older couple who had a grandfather clock fall down in the middle of their living room and actually couldn't get out of the living room because the clock was across the door into the kitchen. So we actually went out and we sorted that. We've also had a gentleman that was made homeless because he'd been in a hotel for temporary accommodation, but that hotel closed, so he was left on the street. So we were able to find accommodation and actually get that accommodation furnished for him very, very quickly. So that's an idea of some of the work that we've done. As we're looking forward now, the main thing is we're looking to the future, and what we need to recognise, of course, is the future is going to be very, very different, and we're already starting to prepare for that and trying to see how we can support and help certainly our older population, because there is going to be an issue of confidence and then wanting to get out and about. So we're already working on that and seeing what our organisation will look like in the future to make sure that we can support them in that way. So that's a bit of an overview.
Hi. My role within Citizens Advice is I have two. One is funding officer, which is why I have a lot of contact with Cumbria Community Foundation, and my other role is as an energy caseworker. Basically, what's happened since COVID-19, as a result of the lockdown, we made various changes and we've had to alter the way we work. And we've also seen that the questions we're being asked have also changed. We transformed the service, which originally we used to see 90% of our clients face to face, to where now over 90% of our queries are dealt with by phone, email, and web chat. Historically, the three highest areas, high number issues, were welfare benefits, debt, and housing. Welfare benefits, obviously, I'm not surprised, you won't be surprised to know, has been our highest area. There have been great changes within the way that the DWP are operating now, and the way they've mobilised their services to deal with the increased number of benefit claims, which Andy mentioned previously. The amount payable to those on universal credit, I'm glad to say, has increased slightly. So this has meant that people are getting a single person is getting approximately £20 per week more, which is good for existing claimants. However, for new claimants who potentially been in employment, can be still a considerable drop in income. With PIP reviews and work capability assessments for existing claimants, these have all been put on hold. So that's actually been an advantage. However, they're on hold. They haven't been stopped completely, so they will re-emerge and potentially give us additional work there. There's also we've seen a slight increase recently in those wanting new PIP claims or new health benefit claims. We've also seen an increase for those requesting benefit checks, again, to make sure that their income is maximised to as much as possible. We have seen a slight drop in referrals regarding benefits because health professionals such as district nurses and Macmillan nurses, because we have a Macmillan contract, but unfortunately fewer diagnoses have been made. We've heard, haven't we, that people with other conditions aren't necessarily going to the hospital. For many who are furloughed, their income potentially has dropped, and there's an uncertainty going forward, as we said, with hospitality, which is something quite high in this area. Debts, with regard to debts or money advice, we've actually seen initially people were contacting us what's going to happen. However, because the government has introduced payment holidays for loans, credit cards, mortgages, overdraft overdraft rules have changed, so there's less interest being charged. What we're finding is actually we've a slight drop in money advice or debt enquiries. However, once the government lifts these things and debt collection agencies start to send letters, make phone calls, again, we expect this to increase. As the other speakers have said, Cumbria Community Foundation have responded very quickly, and we have had 2 successful applications, one for additional support for our volunteers and one for IT equipment, because working from home has brought up its own area of problems. Our volunteers have actually been marvellous, because 80% of our volunteers are actually still volunteering and working from home. In addition to that, we have also, with our volunteer support, been able to increase. So whereas we had 3 drop-in sessions a week when we were doing face-to-face, we're currently operating telephone, email and web chat advice 5 days a week, basically because our volunteers have stepped up to the plate. Mandy, our training supervisor, has also done a great job training them remotely. So the only thing we've got slight issues with, but Citizens Advice National are looking to assist with this, is that we would still like to be able to recruit volunteers, but that obviously is slightly more difficult, but we're trying to put things in place so we are able to recruit volunteers going forward. I think the only other thing that I would like to say, which hopefully most of you will be aware, is that all Citizens Advice offices are independent charities, and on that basis we are all self-funding, so we all have to find our own funding through grants, donations, etc. So hopefully that was within time, Andrew.
Thank you, Lindsay, and to our other panel members. Now, we, if you haven't noticed, we are running a little bit behind because I think it was important for those introductions to be shared. So I'm going to go straight into some Q&A. We've had some questions submitted, and the first one is Stuart Lothian. So, Stuart, I will. You've unmuted yourself. Away you go.
All right. Hi, Andy, and hello to everybody. I'm a trustee with Calvert Trust. I'm also a runner, a member of Eden Runners locally. And Andy, it was interesting to hear that potentially accommodation may not open up until the middle of July, which for Calvert Trust, that's a concern. We've got lots of outgoings and no incoming, so it's a bit sad to hear that. But my question really was more to the running. We know that within our club, Eden Runners, we've got people who are by themselves, people who've got money worries, and I know running's a great way of getting rid of the frustrations. It's a great way to make social contacts. We're able at the moment to run with up to 6 people, but I'm just wondering if you've got any insight as to when we might be able to extend that to larger groups, please.
Yeah, so it's something close to my heart because I'm the chair of Keswick Athletic Club. So and we've had a committee meeting about this this week already. I'll take that hat aside. At the moment, there's no indication that group size is going to change. I think the government are trying to concentrate at the moment on the issues around licensed trade, retail, getting business up and running. I've made representations on our behalf in Cumbria to say that we do need to get overnight stays changed because we've got this massive problem with illicit camping and all the rest of it that's harming the environment and the communities. So I've told them that actually we do want to get our overnight accommodation up and running in a COVID-safe fashion. If they reduce the social distancing from 2 meters to 1 meter, that might be accompanied in a change to how you can get groups together, because clearly if you can be a metre apart, then running in bigger groups is very possible. But unfortunately, as you'll have found out, we often get announcements made on a Thursday evening for implementation on a Friday with no consultation and no prior warning. So at the moment, I've heard nothing that will help you. That's not to say it might not happen tomorrow night and be in place by the weekend, because we just don't know sometimes. Sorry,
okay.
I can't.
Very clear, Andy. Thanks very much. I appreciate your support.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. I appreciate sometimes other people might want to chip in with answers, but want to keep things moving. So Quentin Boys, I'm going to come to you next. I've unmuted your mic.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm a family member, but I've also recently just set up a community research business. My question is based upon the SAGE report, which came out in May, where in the exec summary they clearly said that, I'll just quote it, communities and civil society organisations should have a voice, be informed, engaged and participatory in the exit from lockdown. This pandemic starts and ends with communities, full participation and engagement of those communities on issues such as childcare, etc., 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 will assist with enabling control measures. So my question to the panel is, both fundraisers and distributors, do you think that you collectively have your finger on the pulse of the Cumbrian community? And do you think we understand what they really need? And that's both in terms of the business community and individual communities.
Do you want me to have a go answering that, Andrew?
By all means, yeah, by all means.
Yeah, so there wasn't time in earlier on to just describe the structure that we have for both the wider structure for the LRF, but also how the Community Foundation engages with it. So in every district, there's a community resilience group, and that's got a very wide membership of community organisations, and that feeds into a county group. Now, I'm very fortunate that we have volunteers involved in each of those district community resilience groups, but also the Community Foundation, in its life, has funded over 4,000 organisations, and we have trustees and volunteers all over the county. So I think I'm very confident that both through our own structures and participation in the recovery structures, we can say, yes, we do know what's happening in communities. I think in terms of, do people know about business impact? I have a place on, but don't have time to attend all of them, is the grouping, the BERG, the Business Economic Recovery Group, that's led by the Local Enterprise Partnership. And it has a range of subgroups. And all of these groups have been meeting weekly, sometimes more often. But certainly on the business side, there's very significant business participation. So going back to my point and Andy Slattery's earlier about Cumbria working well together, I think those structures do exist. They can't be perfect, but I think they're as good as we might hope for.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to come back from the panel on that question? No, I'm going to be a bit blunt. Okay, it doesn't sound like it. No one's jumped in, so we shall move on to the next one. Thank you, Quentin, for that question. James Batchelor shall come to you next.
Hi, it wasn't really a question as such. It was just a comment that I work with quite a lot of social housing providers, not particularly within Cumbria, but it was a comment as a reaction to something I think the woman from the Citizens Advice Bureau was making about kind of financial hardship, which was the social housing providers that we work with are seeing a 5 to 7% increase in arrears and rent payments over the last 2 months alone, which would be indicative that the kind of lower, poorer socio-economic groups are being particularly poorly affected by this at the moment. So in terms of kind of coordinating a response, it would seem that that is a group of people that, you know, perhaps the county should be looking at or focusing on in some way. Yeah, it wasn't a question, it was just a comment.
All right, thank you, James. I had a follow-up question from Anne. So we'll move on to the next one. Anne, if you want to pose your question to the panel. I don't know your surname, sorry, but are you there, Anne? I'll ask the question. Oh, there we go.
Sorry. I wanted to ask about education and about schools, and in particular, whether you know what proportion of school children have been able to take part in virtual lessons, and whether or not lack of technology has been a problem, which is something that seems to have been a serious problem for a lot of young people in lots of parts of the country.
Does anyone from the COVID panel want to come back on that? I've got some stats in my head, but it might be nice to hear another voice.
Just personal experience, which many people will have, that it's hard homeschooling, and I'm sure many people will share that. And I know that there was mixed response from various friends of my own children as to whether they're able to access lessons or not.
So thank you, Veronica. I think a wider answer is, I saw in a county council committee report last week, I think there'd been a request for 3,000 laptops to be supplied to individual households. Those are households who are identified as being in particular need. These are vulnerable families. This is not just your family next door. These are seriously in need families. And only 1,000 of those have been able to be addressed. So as I put on my slide around need, I think it's huge. I think many schools don't have either the capacity to have children back in the schools. Parents are not keen about it, but the most disadvantaged families that we support in the main don't have computers in them, don't have Wi-Fi, don't have the ability to support homeschooling, as well as schools having varying abilities to respond. So we think it's a huge issue, but I don't think we have as yet a global number to answer your question, Anne, I'm afraid.
No, but it's an issue anyway, and it needs
needs
somebody to
my
solve
comment
it.
Would be, my comment wouldn't necessarily be so much around the homeschooling, but what we are trying to do is to assist the families to make sure they have got access to the school fuel vouchers, because there were issues with those initially, and where necessary, sort of fair share and food vouchers. We've also this week started, through funding we've received, to be able to issue in certain circumstances fuel vouchers for people who are on prepayment meters. So we're trying to support family existence rather than specifically assisting them with the homeschooling. But obviously, if the parents take away some of the stress of other things, they can concentrate on the homeschooling, hopefully.
Okay.
All right, thank you. We've got a next question which comes in from Claire Hensman. Claire, I think your mic is on.
Hi. Just to ask, we've had 2,000 volunteers supposedly who have offered their services, but I'm aware that not all of them are being used. And obviously, if the CAB needs more volunteers, how do we marry up those who are offering with those that need them?
Sorry, I think this might be me again. I think the Support Cumbria website on which those volunteers sit is actually accessible by voluntary organisations. They can go on there and access them themselves. I know the Community Foundation is planning to meet with Council Voluntary Service and staff from ACT to actually look at the real significant opportunity we have going forward. Is how do you capture the enthusiasm of a whole cohort of new volunteers? We do know, sadly, many of those people volunteered because they were furloughed or they weren't able to go into work, and those people are withdrawing themselves. But it's an open challenge to charities to step up if they can, because it's an open resource.
As I said, we are hopeful with things that Citizens Advice National have put in place for us. Our existing volunteers can do online training and train remotely themselves. What we're looking at is how we can recruit and support, because it's more about the levels of support we can provide new volunteers, or what we would call trainee volunteers. But we do work closely with CVS as well regarding volunteer recruitment. So yeah, we would be in contact with them.
Okay, thank you. So next I'm going to come to Brenda. Brenda Holden, I'll unmute you. Are you there, Brenda? Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my question is around early years. We're an early years provider, and many are through the county. We furloughed staff, so we have been getting some funding from there. But of course, we've lost fees. And through the summer, as we're normally open, we rely entirely on fees. And it's back to the question of parents being comfortable and confident about sending their children in. And I just wondered, you know, what extra help there is out there. Are there any funding streams? Are there grants and things that we're not aware of?
Who would like to take that question on the panel?
Someone from the grants team at the foundation, or Jenny, like to come in on that one. Feel free to unmute your mic if you want to come back on that question.
Yeah, I'll come in. It's Kevin Walsh. So I'm the chair of the grants panel, and we looked at what we could fund quite early on in the programme, and one of the things that we couldn't feel that we could fund was loss of income, because of the scale of the issues that were out there and the amount of money that we've managed to get to date. We haven't been able to offer loss of income. What we are doing is actually providing people with funding where they are changing the way they're doing things and other ways of doing things that way. My understanding is that and Jenny might be able to help me out with this one, is that the lottery, the recent grant funding from the Police and Crime Commissioner, perhaps, and one or two others are available, and most districts' CRG groups are actually listing all the other grant potentials that are out there. So it might be that if you contact your own local resilience group, they'll be able to give you the list of other specific grant areas that there are available. But Jenny might be able to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think feel free to contact us after this meeting. The National Lottery is covering loss of income, and there's a number of funders that can support that work. Also, depending on how you're structured, there might be funding through the local authorities through the discretionary funds. So there's a number of avenues available. So I just suggest we can send you the link if you want to contact us after the meeting. I think that's probably easier.
Thank you.
Andrew, you're muted.
Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, I'm going to move on to a question that has been submitted before the event. I understand that Andy Beeforth has been in discussions with members of the Cumbrian Culture Network, so he's perhaps best placed to answer this question from Chris Wadsworth. The arts are the basis of civilization, vital for the health of our society and communities, and are being given low priority. Galleries will survive, but it's performing arts and music at risk. Just locally, the Theatre by the Lake can't survive in the present circumstances, and the lovely Alhambra Cinema will struggle, as will artists. What can be done to save or support them?
I didn't like to, when I got asked this question 2 weeks ago, and it's not an easy question to answer now. I think the Community Foundation is a funder at the moment with such extreme needs around disadvantage. It's very, you know, I'm a consumer and a great advocate for the arts and culture. But I think many organisations, whether they're charities or businesses, it's a case of hunkering down, making some very hard decisions, and taking use of the limited number of Arts Council and other culture-related funding opportunities. The only other thing I said really was I think culture is going to play a big part in recovery. You know, again, I'm a huge advocate of places like Theatre by the Lake. It's a huge part of the Keswick visitor experience. And I think, you know, I would hope that we will have new regeneration and recovery funds brought forward, and I would hope those sorts of venues will be able to access them. But in the meantime, you know, if they can collaborate with other funders, then other providers to reduce costs and just try and be agile. But it's a very, very difficult time, and I'm sorry, we're just not able to do more.
Okay, thank you. And final question before we go to the breakout rooms, Christopher Holmes, you can unmute your mic if you want to put that question forwards. Are you there, Christopher? No, one last time, and then we're going to go.
Sorry.
Oh, here we go.
Am I here? I do beg your pardon. I was responding earlier to what Brendan was asking about raising money and getting money. I chair the Carlisle Youth Zone, and as such, we're very active in raising money for children's charities, particularly vulnerable children. And so I could get Ruth Southcott, who is our fundraising manager, to make contact with Brendan. It might be of help because it's in the children's area.
All right, thank you, Chris. Okay, we're going to go straight into the breakout rooms. Now, these have been segmented based on groups chaired by CCF representatives. So we're going to go into the breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And then we'll come back here. Now, what will happen is there will be a timer that appears counting down the last 60 seconds of the next 10 minutes, and everyone will automatically be returned to the breakout room at that point. So we'll just get those up and running. You will see a prompt on screen asking you to join the rooms, and these have all been pre-allocated. So here we go. Open them now. All right, everybody, welcome back. Apologies for the breakout rooms not quite going as smoothly as anticipated. We got about half of you in automatically based on the details that were submitted in advance. Obviously, then we just had to rush through allocating the rest of you. So we added a bit of extra time. Hopefully, that was enough for you to have worthwhile conversations within your respective groups. But sorry, the technology didn't quite work as smoothly as expected. So if I could just ask breakout group leaders, you know who you are, you can unmute yourselves, and if you want to just share some of the themes that were brought up in your respective rooms.
I don't mind going first. I was in the East group. Some of the issues that were coming up were obviously concerns from staff who have been furloughed against those who have continued working, burnout of staff that have continued working. So those organisations that have been closed, how to reopen with social distancing measures. I know that we've had conversations with many youth groups who are unable to open at the moment, and even if they do, they're unable to because they don't have the space to accommodate all the young people. But it's also looking at different ways of doing things. So an option was, although the Calvert Trust is closed, could it be used as a facility to look after people who have been cared for, to give carers a break? An issue was working from home and the challenges that that brings, feeling guilty about unable to do in home learning with children. Childcare was a big issue because it also links in with schools being closed and then many businesses unable to have staff back due to childcare issues. But is there a way of opening up the schools so they're not all just on in the classrooms, but can they use school fields? Is there an option to use the village halls? And looking at creative ideas as well. Many people are benefiting from technology, but it's also sometimes about just bringing people together to brainstorm and how to look at fundraising and how to look at reopening. But the main part of it is benefiting from your community. There's lots of groups that have been set up to support people. So it's having that positive interaction with your neighbours and knowing who to go to.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Kevin, you were in Carlisle. Let's come to you next.
I was, yeah. And I think initially we started thinking about how it had been affecting us. And I think part of the discussion there resulted in us agreeing that perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't really affected people evenly. Simple example, there are those of us that have got gardens that have enjoyed the last few weeks. There are a lot of people in the county that haven't. And have been cooped up in smaller areas and not being able to enjoy that sunshine. So there's lots of issues that come out of all of that. And obviously there's all those people that are furloughed that are now feeling the pinch. I think there was an acceptance that things would change. We had an example from one of our panelists, or one of our people in the group, that talked about churches becoming different, perhaps becoming more part of the community and more of a community asset going forward. That was an interesting aspect, and I think certainly from what I've seen of some of the discussions I've had within the Carlisle Resilience Group, groups like Churches Together are really, really keen to actually make sure that they are part of the ongoing development process as we go forward, and make sure that they are part of the solution. The whole issue of social cohesion and when are we going to actually get back to proper communities as we were, or are we? And I think one of the questions that came up was people have been scared into lockdown, quite rightly, because we needed to be able to make sure that we did what we needed to do. But actually trying to come back out of something that people are so scared of is now really difficult. And so there's lots of communication issues, lots of work to do to actually try and make sure that people are comfortable about coming back into communities. And I think that's going to be a difficult one. And then there was the whole issue of the young people who are now scarred because they haven't had the education that they would have expected in the last 3-4 months, and may not get it in the coming months either, to the scale that they need it. And how is that going to affect them in their future employment and such like? There was a suggestion that perhaps some of the young people who aren't necessarily getting jobs coming forward might actually be able to help some of the older generation come to terms with IT and all the things that they need to do to actually get on events like this. You know, there may be some work to do there with youth groups and young groups to actually work closer and bring that social cohesion together, perhaps. Leave it at that for now.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. Let's go to David, who was in West.
Yes, hi, David Beebe here. I think one of the scary thoughts that came out, and certainly makes some sense, is that we're probably in, it may seem strange to say this, but we're in the calm phase, and the storm is to come, because there's a huge economic storm still to come, and that has to be dealt with. I think particularly in the West, of course, nuclear is a big part of the West, and so the nuclear sector somewhat protects some parts of the West, but as we know, there are plenty of parts of organisations in the West that are being badly affected. One of our cohort was an accountant and deals with charities and farmers, and most of those are suffering. You know, a few are okay, but most are suffering, and so it's a very difficult time. Very strong view about getting kids back to school as soon as possible. It should be an absolute priority. And interesting thoughts around, you know, yes, as a result of technology, there might be more home working, less travel, more part-time maybe. The high street, is it changed forever? Or are we being influenced by this 2 or 3 months that we've now experienced, and actually in 6 months' time, things will have gone back to much more back to normal than we can imagine today. And I think the one thing that people would really hope doesn't go back to normal is, you know, that we harness the community spirit that has been built up and support the volunteers. And how can we maintain the volunteer network that has been established? So there was one example that we were given in, I think in Birmingham, there's about 2,500 volunteers. So that would be similar to Support Cumbria, but every one of those is being phoned to say, what would you like to do? How would you like to help? What can you do going forward? And would something like that effectively harness that new volunteer network or growing volunteer network? I think those are the key points.
Great, thank you, David. Let's carry on round the coast and go to Barrow and Jane Morby.
Hi, so we had to talk about the creative and cultural sector, and it really built on what we were saying earlier, that although the grant making strategy from the Community Foundation at the moment is about focusing on that real level of disadvantage and immediate need. We talked about how important it is that we don't forget about the creative and cultural sector, and we keep waving the flag that that area needs support, and an acknowledgement that this is going to be long term for the creative and culture and the visitor economy. As Andrew said earlier, it's about this issue of 3 winters, because we potentially will lose that whole spring and summer income this year. We talked about impact on charities, and the hospice outlined that they were having a huge uptake in demand for bereavement support because of the people don't have the networks around them that they might normally have to help them at a difficult time, and because they can't go through the rituals that they would go through in terms of saying goodbye at a funeral, for example. So the hospice have come up with creative solutions using technology to address some of that, and that led us on to a talk about technology and how that's really been a positive that's come out of this, is that people are accessing technology in a different way, and that will benefit them moving forward. We also talked about the level of community support in terms of individuals, in terms of people doing fundraising activities. I know in Barrow we've had 12 people have shaved their heads and filmed it and raised nearly £9,000 for Barrow Food Bank. The hospice talked about the level of support that they've had in terms of fundraising and people making donations. So there has been a real community spirit of people coming together to support the third sector generally. But the message is very much that that's going to be a long-term need, and some of that support might get exhausted in the short term, and we've got to make sure that we're looking at the long term and that level of need. And then finally we talked about what people need, and it's very much about where can people access a Cumbria-wide view of like support that's available, for example, because we all know that Cumbria has this unique geography where there are pots of support available around the county, and it's how do people get that Cumbria-wide view, and maybe the foundation is in a good position having the Cumbria-wide coverage to be able to do some of that.
Okay, thank you. And finally, let's finish on the south with Glenys.
Yeah, thank you. We talked about some of the groups like the Calvert Trust, which has already been mentioned, and how they open, because they're going to need the income from residents to be able to open not just their traditional services, but their new services. Something about solicitors, because most people actually like to go in and see their solicitor, and they don't really want to do all of that continued dialogue online with them. There was some concern about this extended and prolonged education for children, and it would have been a good idea to have had a Cumbria-wide learning platform so that there could be some equity across the county of the kind of lessons that were available. There was risk of a second lockdown, and we discussed the need to have granular local ideas addressing that. So if there's a spike, another spike, for example, in Kendal or in Barrow, then it's not going to affect the whole of the county. There are some charities who haven't been able to adapt to do something via the COVID funding and have found it really difficult, and some of them are really worried about surviving. So how do we actually build upon the work that they've been doing to enable them to open and restart some of their additional work? A big need still about cash, and some lead from the government about clarity for hospitality, and that needs to be really quite quickly.
All right, thank you everybody. Thank you for all the contributions in the individual breakout rooms, and thank you for the sum up there. And I'm going to hand back to Andy now, Andy Beeforth, and you will just no doubt have taken some of those comments and feedback on board, and you'll just give a quick summary and round off the session.
Yeah, first of all, thank you again, everyone, for taking part, the panel members, and you who've chosen to give up your time. I'm sorry technology and our enthusiasm has meant that we've rather crushed the time. So I hope you feel it's been worthwhile. So I won't say much more, but I think I just made a few notes. We clearly are far from out of this. There's much more need. And I think the challenge is to build on the enthusiasm, the undoubted collaboration, the community spirit. I don't think this is false pride to talk about the way Cumbria has responded. I'm absolutely incredibly proud of my own organisation's response, but we've only been able to do what we've been able to do because of the partnerships that we have and the groups that we have to fund. So I think that power of generosity and that power of collaboration is something that we really need to hang on to. So we've got, and we'll share with you via email, it's really quite short, but the distilled wisdom in terms of what we think is needed within our revised COVID-19 grant strategy. And I just wanted to sort of shape, it's only 3 headings. So we know that there's going to be continued need to support vulnerable people. That's undoubted. But we are moving into a stabilisation and strengthening phase. And that's really important. Some of the things we've heard about charities and the need to help them both stay alive, but also change what they do. And then more importantly, or finally, the recovery and renewal phase and the contribution we can all make to that, knowing that, you know, we will come out the other side of this, and we do want to build back better. So the final thing, we've raised £1.5 million. Many of you have contributed in some way. We may run future events like this in the future, but please just do remember that we can only do what we do through the generosity of people and people like yourselves. So do spread the word, and if you can help in terms of contributing to the work of the foundation, please do. Have a safe and enjoyable evening, a good weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all again, and thank you, team, for organising.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you sticking with us through some of those technical difficulties, putting people into breakout rooms, and for making the contributions and supporting the event. So that's it. That's it. We'll wrap up today, and we'll see you at another meeting. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon.